Thanks everyone for joining, and my name is Adam. Before we get started, I would like to give a big thanks for all our subscribers because your support motivates not only me, my entire team to ensure we always keep delivering some interesting webinars like this. So in case if you are new and if you haven't subscribed, so don't forget to give a like, share, and subscribe to our channel. So with this, what's the topic that we have today? So Kubernetes is one of the very important subject when we talk about DevOps or in the day of DevOps engineer. So it's not just to use Kubernetes, but anytime if you get an error, we always have to focus on how do we debug and provide a fix. Now, this is where most of the students, right, who already say that, hey, I've learned Kubernetes, but I don't know how to debug. So this session is to make sure that you can easily approach a problem that you get in the application side. So again, I'm not talking on the cluster side, but typically when you deploy an application in Kubernetes, what are the general or common issues that you would face and how do you easily approach them? So in that way, I would like to talk about 13 common and most important types of problems that you will be facing in day to day. All right. So with that, now, anytime, let's say you're working and a QA or a developer or a customer says that the application is not working or they are not able to access the application, or if there is an error, how do you start to debug in Kubernetes, or how do you triage your errors or troubleshoot your errors? Now, before you get started with anything, now the first point you have to look at is what is the status of the pod, right? So this is the very first step that you have to do. Now, once again, if you are a beginner to this and you're not clear, let me also explain it a little bit and then get into the concepts. But first, what happens? So let's assume you have a YAML file, which we also call it as the manifest file in Kubernetes, in which you define your pod or deployment or any other object that you need. Now, as soon as you run a kubectl apply command or a helm install, whatever is equivalent. So what happens? The information that you have put into the YAML file is sent to the master, in which the API server will receive and it'll try to pass it to the controller. Now, this is when the first activity that happens is Kubernetes or the master looks at your content, what you have given, which is like the desired state. For example, let's say I want a pod. So now Kubernetes says, okay, Adam wants a pod. So what it should do? It should now find out a machine in the cluster that is on the data plane or the worker nodes, and it needs to make sure that a machine which is matching my requirement for creating the pod, on that machine, the pod will be first assigned. So this is where the scheduler in the master finds out the right machine which is suitable for my pod, and it assigns. Okay. Now, only when it assigns, the next step happens, because sometimes there could be an error in the pod assigning or scheduling to a machine. So that's where we'll see how do we debug. Okay. But again, first let's understand the first step is pod gets assigned to a worker node or a machine in the data plane. Then once the pod is assigned, after that, the image will be downloaded. So you want to create a container on the pod for which what exactly is the image you need, right? So that image will be downloaded. Now, after the image is downloaded, on that machine where the pod is assigned, a container will be created from the image. And after the container is created, then the container will start running the startup command or whatever the command that you have given to run inside the container. Okay. Now, there could be some errors where your pod is scheduled, but while downloading the image, there could be an issue, or while the container is getting created, there could be an issue. So that's another status of the pod in which we need to understand how to debug. Then once the image is downloaded, container is created, and your container has started running the startup command or the application inside, then there could be some issues with respect to the application or the command that you are running in the container, which is what mode of what we call it as the runtime error. So before you jump into debugging, so what we have to understand is what is the state of your pod, or what is the status of your pod. Out of these three, where exactly is your pod? And then according to that, you need to take different steps to debug it. Okay, so consider this, and whatever the examples that we are going to talk about will be completely related. Okay, and that's how you will also be able to debug the problems. Now, I already have some examples created for all these 13 scenarios, but it requires some changes that you have to do in your cluster. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to typically take a Minikube cluster, which I have already created in my AWS account. Okay, so that's what I have. Now, apart from that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a script, a shell script. Okay, now I have all the code already put into this repo that you can go back and check. So this is under my GitLab account. Learn DevOps Easy, Troubleshoot, and Kubernetes apps. So in this, there's a folder called lab where I have put all those 13 examples and related YAML file. And along with it, there is a shell script called run me. Now, I have written it in such a way that for every example that you want to try, or for all these 13 options that you want to try, just run the script, and the script will help you to prepare your Minikube accordingly, and it will be very easy for you to prepare. Okay, so in that way, let me show you first how to run this script. Now, I'm just connecting to my Minikube. Now, when you're running Minikube, always make sure that you're running it as root. Okay, and just to show you, there is only one node in it. All right, and I do not have anything available. And what I've already done, I have cloned this project. And here you see these two scripts. Now just run the script with an option called -h, which will give you the help. So what you have to do is run the script and pass a option, like option 1, option 2, and like this there are 13 options, and each of the option will prepare a scenario and it will run an example so that you will exactly face the issue, because this is the area where in real time, if you want to learn, it's not possible unless and until you recreate the scenario. So that's the reason the script will help you to create. So for me also, I'll try to run the script with options one by one, which will also try to help us in demo. Okay, so first thing, what we will do is, how do I know the status of the pod that I was trying to tell? For this, you need to run the very first command called as kubectl get pods. Okay, so I'll clear the screen and I'll say kubectl get pods. Now you can always add a hyphen watch, which will be continuously printing the same commands output every second. So right now you see there is no pod. Now as we start creating our pods, this will help us to know at what status it is there, whether the pod has been scheduled to a machine, or after scheduling is the container creating or some issue, or container created, what else is happening. Okay, now this is where this is the first command that you would be using a lot. So kubectl get pods. Now let this be running. What I'll do, I'll open another command prompt and I'll connect to the machine, and once again I'll switch the user to root, and we'll go to this folder, and I have the script. So here what I'll do, let me run the first option. So just say run me.sh followed by the option. So what will this option do? So this will introduce us the first scenario. Okay, so the first scenario that we need to know how to troubleshoot is called as insufficient resource. Okay, so if you look at the screen, this is where the status of the pod is pending. Okay, so what do you mean by pending? So this means your pod for some reason could not be assigned to a machine. So this clearly says you are in this first status or the first phase where pod itself has not been assigned to a machine. So to get the exact problem, now you need to run another command called kubectl describe and then describe the pod. So I'll take this, all right, and what we will do, I'll just cancel and I'll just say kubectl describe pod and the name of the pod. So if you come down in the pod, if you describe at the end, there is something called as event. So which is the second command which will help us to know a little better about what is the problem. So first we understood pod is in pending state, which means pod is not yet assigned to a machine. Why exactly will be known by the event. So here it clearly says that my pod needs some memory, but that memory is not available in any machine in our cluster. Now, since we are using Minikube, there is only one machine in my cluster, and that also doesn't have the capacity. So what is the capacity if I look? So I have a 4 GB machine that I've taken, out of which I have close to 1.8 GB RAM available. But now let's look at the code on why it is giving me this error. So let's go to this. All right. And here I would like to take the first example, that is insufficient resources. Okay, so now I've taken a deployment object with one replica, and this is where I'm just running a pod with one sample or a dummy container with Ubuntu printing my name every 10 seconds. That's not a problem. But what exactly we have done? So while defining my pod for the container, I have told the resources. And this is where I have told I need a minimum of 4 GB. So go back to your basics or what we have learned in the class. When you try to define a pod with a resource, there are two things, request and limit. Request is the minimum capacity needed for the pod to get assigned to a machine, right? That is the request. And limit is the maximum resource that it can use when the pod is running on a particular machine. So this way, now, as soon as you do a kubectl apply, and if you have a resource defined with a request, Kubernetes will find whether is there any worker node with the capacity of what you have given. And this is where, as we just now saw, my machine has less than 4 GB, and that is where it is clearly telling that there is a insufficient memory. So how do we address? So we need to first find out whether your cluster has enough machines with the right capacity. If not, you need to add more machines to the cluster. Okay. If not, if you have enabled the auto scaling, like you have using Carpenter or the cluster autoscaler, then whenever such a kind of issue happens, Kubernetes will automatically create a new machine. But that will work only if you are using a cluster managed by cloud like EKS or AKS. But when you use your own managed cluster, this will not be possible. So you need to first find out why there is no resource, and if needed, add more resource. And another way that you can also look at is talk to the dev team and QA team and find out, do we really need 4 GB, or what is the minimum capacity that is needed for this pod to run? Okay, so that's how the first step is to make sure that you have the minimum capacity that is needed, that is called as request, and it is matching with any one of the machine. So that way, when it finds out, Kubernetes will assign the pod to a machine which matches your request or the minimum capacity needed. All right. So that's the first error, which is insufficient resource, which could be CPU or memory. I have just taken an example of memory. Okay. Again, here, just to show you again, describe. Okay, I didn't get the pod first. So again, kubectl describe pod. So this is how you debug. First, look at the status of the pod, and if it is pending, do a describe of the pod, and then look at the event. And here it's very straightforward, and it is saying that your pod is not assigned because of insufficient memory. So like I said, What is the resolution? So the solution for this is find out with the dev team or QA team, do you really need this capacity? And find out whether your cluster has enough capacity. If not, you need to add more worker nodes. Okay, fine. And I have written the script once again in such a way, as soon as you finish each of the practice, right, you can even go and delete the pods so that for the next example, your minikube cluster is ready. Now, this is where you can see as soon as I run the script, it just gives you the message that it's prepared for a particular scenario. And after that, at the end, do you want to close? Now, since I'm using AWS, it gets frequently disconnected, but still not an issue. I'll show you again. So let me go to this folder. And if I run the script again, it doesn't matter how many times you run the same option because it's already applied the YAML file, so it won't do anything. So now if I want to go ahead and delete, so if I just say yes, then it will exactly delete the objects or the pod what we have created. So in our example, the pod that just now got created, it's deleted. Okay. So this is where the first scenario is insufficient resource, where your pod is in the pending state. Okay. Next, let's try out an option 2. And what is option 2? Option 2 is again your pod is not getting assigned to a machine and it is in the state called pending. Okay, you can see. But once again, what could be the scenario for it? Now, this scenario is called as node affinity. So, what is node affinity? Let's try to understand. Now, again, I'll do a kubectl describe pod and the pod name, and this should give you the event. And in the event, once again, it is telling the scheduler didn't find any machine in your cluster, and because of that, it's not able to assign or schedule the pod. But what's the reason? So the reason is pod or the node affinity or selector. So that's where now when this problem happens, suppose if you have told the Kubernetes or the pod that you want this pod to be created on a particular machine with the help of some label. And if that label is not found on any machine, then Kubernetes will say that I couldn't find any machine which is the selector or affinity, and because of that, it is not able to schedule. Now, to understand this quickly, if you come back, now I have another example here, which is the node affinity. So if you open what I have told, the same deployment example with one replica, in the end, I'm telling my pod should be created on a machine where there is a label called my node equal to demo node. Okay. And what is the output saying? So it's saying that it's not able to find any machine with this label. Okay. And that's where, what is the solution? So the solution is find out which is the right machine to create this pod. And on that machine, you have to create the label, for which you can run some command like kubectl label node and the node name and what label you want. Once again, now for showing you the demo, what I will do, watch this. So first thing, kubectl get nodes, and you can use show label. And out of this, there are a lot of labels available, but you do not see a label that we need, that is my node is demo node. Okay. So what we will do now, I'll go ahead and apply the label. Okay. And then we should see the pod is getting assigned. So how do I do that? Again, I don't want you to do anything manually. So you can take the same script. Okay. So if you read the script for the second option, it's asking you, okay, you have applied, but I do see that there is a label needed. So do you want to apply the label? So that's where if you're not familiar with those commands, I have written the script which can be helpful for you. Now just go ahead and say apply command and see over here what happens. So as soon as you apply the label on that particular machine, you see from pending, it goes into container creation and container running. What exactly is it? Again, come back and see the output, kubectl describe pod. So as soon as we applied the label, then Kubernetes found that there is a machine matching the label, and that is the node affinity, and it then assigned the pod. So this is where, so once the pod gets assigned, then the image will be downloaded, and then on that machine using the image downloaded, it will create the container, and then it will go to start the container, which is nothing but running the startup command in the script. And only when it comes, you can also see the status. Okay. So while it was downloading the image, the status will be container creation. And if container creation is success and your container is also running the startup command or the application, then the status becomes running. Okay, so this is something which you need to also know. Fine. So we have practiced the second example also. So now again use the same script, and it's asking, do you wish to delete? Yes. And your pods will also get deleted. All right. So the second example or the scenario what we have seen is node affinity, in which if your pod doesn't have the right label matching a machine, then your pod will be still not assigned. Okay, so to debug, as I said, find out if all the machines or the respective machine has a label. If not, you have to apply the label on the correct machines so that your pod gets assigned or created to that machine. All right, cool. Now we tried two examples. Now let's try the third option. So what is the third option? Once again, third option is again in the pending state, which means for some reason your pod is not able to get assigned to a machine. And this time the scenario is called as unbound persistent volume. What exactly is that? Again, if you find the state as pending, then go ahead and do a kubectl describe and look at the event. So it clearly says that your pod is not able to get assigned to a machine because it didn't find any persistent volume claim. So once again, coming back to basics, what we have learned in our classes earlier. So as soon as you assign a pod, what will happen if your pod has a persistent volume to be attached to your container, depending on the application, then while the pod is getting assigned, it will also make sure that the persistent volume is attached to the pod. Only then your pod will even go to image download. This is because when you are trying to create a container, you need to make sure whatever is necessary for the application to run, it should be available. So that way, your persistent volume is needed for some reason to copy some files like log files from your pod or some configurations from your application. So in that case, before your container starts, your pod should have a volume. And that is where if you have a requirement of persistent volume, and if that persistent volume is not available for any reason, then your pod will also not get assigned to any machine. Okay. So again, let me show you the YAML file so that, all right, so where is that? So here, what is that I've done? I've created a persistent volume claim where I'm saying I need 1 GB. Okay. And in my pod definition, I'm telling use this claim. So when you run this pod will take this claim and it will search in your cluster, do you have any persistent volumes available? If there is no persistent volumes available, then your claim will not work, and that's the reason your pod is still in the pending state. Now quickly to check, you can run this command called kubectl get pvc. So this is the claim, and you can see the claim is in also pending state because you do not have any persistent volume. So what we have to do, so either if you are the administrator, then you need to create and make sure that your persistent volumes are available. If not, there is a separate admin for your cluster, then you need to work with them and tell that, hey, you are using a claim of 1 GB. Now for that, it is the administrator responsibility to make sure that persistent volumes are available. Now, there could be another reason sometime where you are trying to create a dynamic persistent volume. For that, there is another object called storage class. Okay. So now what does the storage class will do? For example, if I have set my storage class to refer to a AWS storage like AWS EBS, then whenever I create a claim, automatically the claim will go to the AWS and create a EWS storage, and that EBS storage will be mapped to your cluster. So that's how dynamically you can create. So right now, for example, you can see I have not set any storage class, and it is using the default storage class, which is not able to create any persistent volume. So the solution for this is either make sure there is already persistent volume available. If not, you need to set your storage class in such a way that it can dynamically connect to a cloud like AWS and create a storage and a persistent volume together. Okay, so that's how you're going to resolve this. But once again, all these are the scenarios where your pod is still in the pending state, which means your pod has not been assigned to a machine. So these are the scenarios that you could get. Okay, my screen got hung. Now let me close this and connect again. Now this is an issue. Anyway, not a problem. So what I'll do, I'll again run and option 3. Anyway, so here it's asking, do you want to delete? Yes, I want to delete. So it will go ahead and delete the claim that you're generating as well as the pods associated. All right. So this is a third scenario where your pod is still not created or assigned to a machine. Now let's get into another scenario. So this time let's go with option 4. So what is option 4? Okay. Option 4 is also a pending state only, where your pod is still not able to get assigned. And what is it called as? So it's called as node taint. So what is node taint? Let's understand. Again, to understand it better, first you have to do a kubectl describe pod and the pod name. And if you see, it says in your cluster, there is only one machine, and that machine has a property called taint. So go back to our advanced Kubernetes classes or the administration classes, or for others, if you go back and look at, there is a concept called taint. So taint is nothing but a label that you can apply on a machine. So if you apply a label called taint on any machine, what will happen? You cannot create a pod on it. So the only way that you can create a pod on a machine which has taint is you need to use a pod property called toleration, which is matching the same label. Okay. So now if I go back to my example to show you, so this is the taint. I don't have any label or anything applied. So there is only one machine I'm trying to create. And this is where, if you come back and look at this, now how do you find out whether a machine has a taint or not? So what you can do, you can do a describe. All right. So I'll just say kubectl describe pod, sorry, not pod, it's node, the node name, and grep for a word called taint. Now this is where you need to describe a node, not just the pod, because pod told there is a taint. So what is that taint? You can come and run. You can see your machine that we have in the cluster has already applied with a label called taint equal to true. Now, these are the things the shell script already does in between so that you can prepare for the scenario. So now, if you want pod to get to this machine only, then in your pod spec or under the container, you need to add a property called toleration, and that should exactly match the same label of the taint called taint true. Okay, so this is how only when you have a toleration in your pod matching the taint of the machine, your pod will be allowed to create on a machine. If not, taint will make sure no pods is getting assigned to a machine. So this is another scenario where your pods will be in which phase? It's on the pending phase. Okay. So this is the fourth example why your pods are not even getting created or assigned to a machine. Okay, fine. Now we have been seeing more of the pods not getting assigned scenarios, right? There's four scenarios. Now let's look at another scenario in which what happens after your pod gets assigned to a machine, right? So that's where image can get downloaded and create the container and start the container. You saw the describe command earlier, right? The same way. So let's go ahead and run option 5. And this is where we are moving to the next phase. That is, once a pod is getting assigned to a machine, if there is an issue with the container creation, then what are the different scenarios you will get through? And that's what we are trying to see. Okay. So now you can see first pod is in pending state, but it moved from the pending state to container creation. So this clearly indicates that your pod got scheduled or assigned to a machine. Okay. But after that, while it is trying to create the container, there is some step or something is wrong. So how do we find out? Once again, use a kubectl describe command for this. Okay. And describe the pod and give the pod name. And if you look down, it clearly says that first your pod got assigned to a machine, but after that, there is something called config map, which is not found. So again, go back to our basics. Suppose if you want a application property file or a configuration file to be injected inside your container, then you define the property while you're creating the pod to take the file from a config map object and inject it into the pod. So once again, before the container is getting created, your pod should have the reference of the config map file, because only then it can mount it as a volume inside your container. So assume your pod created without this configuration file available, then the application will anyhow fail. So that's where if you have specified to use config map and to mount it inside your container on a particular folder, and if that is not available, then your container will not even get created. Okay, and this is where, just to show you that example, so you can see I'm telling while my container is created, I want a folder called temp config in which I want a file called sample conf coming from a object called config map. So this is how automatically when you create a container, your config file will be available and the application will start. Now here, since this configuration map object itself is not available, it's clearly saying that I cannot create the container. So pod got assigned, but in order for even creating the container, your config map itself is not available, because only when this is available, it will try to mount it inside the folder while the container is creating. And since it is not available, your volume is not created and your container is also not created. And that's why you see that the error at which we are stuck now is container creation. Okay. So yeah, to check once again, run the command called kubectl get config map, or short name is CM. So right now there is one default config map, but the config map that we need is called as my map. Okay, and that is not available. That is why your pod is in creating state. So to debug, make sure you have the config map created, and in the config map you have the right file associated. Only then, while the container is creating, this will be injected. So remember, only when all these steps are done, the container will actually go ahead and create. Okay, fine. Now it got stuck. Let me run it again. Yeah, bear with me for some time. So again, I'll go to this folder and I'll run the script using option 5. So option 5 was unavailable config map. So anyway, go ahead and delete. So all those things what it tried to create for the example will be gone. All right. Now we have seen 5 options. Now let's see another options. Again, it's terminating. All right. Now the next option that we would see is similar to config map. If you need some sensitive data like passwords to be injected into your container, or you need some certificate files to be injected into your container, then we will not use config map. You will use another object called secret. Okay. Now, exactly like config map, for a secret also, you need to make sure that pod can reach the secret object, and it will try to mount to the container. Only then it goes ahead with the container creation. So if there is an error where the secret object is not found, similar to this, container will not get created. Okay. So your container creation is equivalent to running the application. So for that, whatever is the necessary configuration, everything should be available. So that's another scenario that we will see where your secret object is not available. Okay. Yeah, let this complete and then we'll go ahead. Okay. So it deleted successfully. All right. So let's try to run our script with the next option. And this is where unavailable secret. So similar to the previous one, your pod is in pending state and then it moved to creation. That is container creation, which means pod got assigned to a machine, but for some reason container is not able to create. So same way, you go ahead and do a describe of this pod. You should see pod got assigned to a machine, but the next thing is it's trying to read a password called my password, and it is not available, because of which it's not able to set up a volume inside the pod. And that's where container creation is not success. So again, to check this example, if you come down, I have this file, secret file. And here, if you look at in the end, you will see that I have a secret object which I need called my password, and I want that to be available in my container under the temp config. Assuming if my container starts or application starts, it will read some file here. Now, this is a dummy example, but assume this is the case. And that's where when this secret object itself is not found. So again, you can type the command kubectl get secret, and yeah, there is a default secret, but the secret that we need is my password, which is not available. And because of that, your pod is clearly saying I cannot go ahead and create the container. So this is another scenario in which your pod is assigned, but container creation is failing. Okay. All right. So we completed it. Now let's move to the next example. Again, I'll put the pod in watch state. And now let's try option 7. So what is option 7 now? So we have seen scenarios where pod itself is not able to get assigned to a machine, and then pod is assigned, for some reason your container creation is failed. But now let's look at another problem, which is called as resource quota. Okay. Now this is again a unique issue where your pod is not created, but this time it's a little different error. So you can see now, first pod got assigned to a machine, and then container is getting created, and in fact container is also created and it is running successfully. Then what is the issue that we might face? Or you might be wondering, where is the issue? And that's when I want you to pay attention. There are actually two replicas here. Okay. And for both replica, it is saying running, which means pod got assigned to a machine. Well, I can show you this quickly. So first, get pods. There's only two pods you can see. And if you describe any of the pod, well, pod got assigned to a machine, image got downloaded, and container got created, and it is running. And that's why you see the status of the pod as running. Then what's the issue? So now quickly come back to the example, and I want to see this. Okay. Quota. Yeah. So watch example. So what I've told is I want 3 replicas in my deployment object. Always Kubernetes has to make sure that there are 3 replicas. But how many replicas do we see here? There is only 2 replicas. So what happened to the third replica? And there is no error. In fact, it is not even showing an entry of a pod. Now that's why it might be confusing. So to understand it better, now go back and look into the basics of our classes. We understood whenever we say deployment object, it creates another object called replica set, and that replica set will create the pod. And this is where now if you do kubectl get deployment object, it clearly says out of 3 only 2 pod is there. And equivalent to that, if you do a kubectl get replica set or rs command, you see out of 3 only 2 is there. And now you see why replica set is not able to create the third replica. Okay. Now this is another issue where sometime you wanted 3 or 4 replicas, and only 1 or 2 pods are being created and running. Others, there is no clue. And QA or customers say that there is too much of load. So then you need to find out, okay, you wanted desired is 3 replicas, but only 2 are running. So now you do a kubectl describe of the replica set object. Okay, so I'll say kubectl describe rs means replica set and the name of the replica set. And this is where it clearly gives you an error where in my namespace, I have limited or set a resource quota. Again, go back to your administration classes. So in Kubernetes, there is an object called resource quota, that you can apply to a namespace, in which you can control how many pods or replicas should be created or running inside a namespace. So this is how, when you create a deployment object for a QA, for example, you have to control on how many pods is needed, because QA don't need unnecessarily more than 2 or 3 pods. So in that case, when QA tries to create some kind of more pods, then your resource quota will restrict. So exactly what we have done in my example, the shell script has already applied a resource quota where it is going to say only 2 pod is allowed in your namespace. Okay. However, we are trying to create 3, and that is where 1 is going into the request state, and that is not at all being considered, because it clearly says that you are exceeding the quota. So what you want is 2, but you are trying to create 3. So in this case, there is actually no error. Then either make sure that your deployment object has the enum number of replicas, or for some reason you want 3 replicas, then try to update the resource quota object, okay, and allow the pods from 2 pods to 3 pods. Okay, so this is another scenario where there is no error, but your number of replicas is not matching. All right, again, this got stuck. I can just delete it. Oh, not this, it's the option 7 we tried. So let me delete and redelete this. So the option 7 is what we were trying. So resource quota, and then go ahead and say yes. So it will delete the pods. All of them should get terminated. Okay, it's getting terminated. All right, so now let's look into the second option. Sorry, the next option will be option 8. Again, this is one of the very popular error which you might get in an interview. Okay, so this is called as image pull back off. So what's happening? If you look at the pod status, from the pending, the pod moved to container creation. But in that, you're getting an error while pulling an image, and it goes into a loop where it's not able to download the image. So this kind of error occurs when your pod has been assigned to a machine, but after assigning the pod, so let's say there is proper volumes, config map, secret, everything is there. But now the next thing it has to do is download the image. And this is where, due to various reasons, like if your image tag is not proper, or there could be a credential issue, or there is some permission issue where you are not able to download. So in all scenarios, what will happen? Your image pulling will be failing, and because of that the container will not go to the creation at all, because only when the image has been downloaded we will go to the container creation. So this is something, even before the container creation you will get this error. Okay, now to understand, if you do a describe of the pod and look at the events, you can see the pod got assigned to a machine, and then I'm trying to download a image. Now this is where I've made it purposely to give an error in a way that there is no image with this name. Okay, I've just given a dummy tag, in fact. So because of this, it clearly says that it's not able to find this image with whatever the tag you have given in the Docker Hub registry. And because of that, your image pull will be failing. So in this case, you simply have to go back and look at image and find out whether you have given the right image or the right tag or the repository is correct. If not, are you using some kind of credentials which is not correct? So you have to debug those and fix it. So only then your image will be able to download properly. Okay. Right. Right. Now, once again, let me go to the pod status. And this is also, again, a very popular error. For this, let's go with option 9. So this is called as crash loop backoff. Okay. So what is crash loop? So for some reason, your container is getting crashed. Okay. And again and again and again, it's going into crash mode. So when does it happen? So that's where there are a lot of scenarios in which your container can go into a crash mode. So to understand it, once again, if you look at this first, from pending state, you were able to download the image and then the container got created. But while the container is getting created, and your container is running the startup command, well, it moved to this, but while the container is running your startup command, there are some issues because of which the container started, but again it failed. So because of this, what will Kubernetes do? Go back to our classes where the basics of pod. If there is a container inside a pod and if the container gets stopped or crashed for some reason, pod will try to recreate. So what is happening in this scenario? Pod is creating a container and container is running and container is failing. Because of that, pod will try to recreate the container. Again, container runs, it fails. Once again, pod is trying to recreate. So this method where container is failing and pod is trying to recreate again and again is what we call it as crash loop. Okay. So to understand, again, let's say kubectl describe command and see what exactly it is giving the error. Okay. Now, in this example where it clearly says that it's a crash loop and you do not get any output from this, because this will just say that, I mean, the events will just give you the output where container got created, but after that your container is trying to get restarted. That's all. So how do we figure it out what exactly is the issue? So one of the way that you can find out is from the message. It says crash loop, but it also says OOM. So OOM means out of memory. So what this means, when your container is running the application, your application doesn't have enough memory while the application is running. And because of that, your application is getting stopped and then your container is trying to be recreated. And once again, while it is running, application again tries to reach and take whatever the memory it needs from the machine, and which is again not available. So it gets into a crash loop. Okay. So this is where if you now come back and look at the YAML example, what I have done purposely for the sake of demo, I have taken a container in which there is a Linux command called stress. And especially for those who have gone through the classes, you will know, but if not others, stress is a Linux command which is used to do some kind of testing by adding load to your container or application. So what I'm doing now, to create this container, I am telling maximum of 200 MB is allowed, which means pod can allow 200 MB. But purposely, I am trying to run the stress command and I'm trying to tell the stress to put a load or utilize 200 MB. So because of which, what is happening? Your container is trying to use 250 MB, but the moment you reach 200 MB, pod will cut down the limit. And because of that, this container or the command fails, and as soon as this fails, container will be recreated. And that is where it is going into a crash loop. Okay. So the first scenario for crash loop is out of memory. So how do you fix this? To fix, first you need to understand to talk to dev team or QA team and find out how much of actual memory or resources is needed for your pod. Okay. And in case if you need more memory or more resources for your container, then you have to change your maximum, that is the limit, and give a little more than what is needed. So in those case, when you run, your machine will have enough capacity and your container will use the maximum limit. Now in this example, I should set my maximum memory, that is the limit memory, something above 250, let's say around 280 or 300 MB. So that way, when my container runs, it can use a maximum of 300, not beyond it. Okay. Again, it got stuck. So let me recreate. And again, it's not 8, it's option 9. Let me rerun it. Yeah, I'll delete the pod properly. That's where no matter how many times you rerun, simply go ahead and delete. Okay. So we saw how your container gets into a crash loop mode because of memory. This is one scenario. Now another scenario which we will try to see is on the same crash loop. So let's put the pods in watch mode. And this time I'll say option 10, which is once again crash loop, but for a different reason. So again, pod got assigned to a machine, image is downloaded, container is created, and container is running successfully. Okay. However, if you wait for some time, you should see container fails. And because the container fails, your pod will try to recreate. And if this continues to happen multiple times, that is minimum of 3 times, then it will be marked as crash loop. Okay. Now, let me first show you this error when it comes up. So it takes around 30 seconds because of the configuration I have given. Yeah, so you could see that your container was just a glitch. There was only one output, but you can see there was another output. If you wait for some time, it would again show it as running, even though there is no change. Why? Before we go to that, let me show you once again that it will print again. And you can see there's a gap of 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, your container will be recreated. Okay. Now, this is because in this scenario, there will be a failure in health check. So once again, before you decide anything, run the kubectl describe command and find out what exactly is the issue. See, it just now came here. Now this is where if you go ahead and do a kubectl describe pod, and you should see your pod running fine, container got created, container is started, and the application is running. And this is when in Kubernetes we have something called as health check, right? Liveness probe or readiness probe. Now if you take liveness probe, which is a health check, so if you have given a health check for your pod or container, and if that health check fails continuously for 3 times, then Kubernetes will try to recreate the container. So that is where it is another mode in which your container is going into crash loop. So it creates container, runs the container when your health check fails 3 times, and again the container will be deleted and pod will try to recreate a new container. So that's what is happening here. And for this, if you look at this example, now crash loop, which is health check here, for the example, I have taken a deployment object with one replica or one pod in which I'm running Apache, and inside Apache, I'm doing a health check by running a command called ls temp lp. Now, obviously, there is no such file inside this container. So when you run, it will try to give you an error, which means it will assume, or the pod will assume, that your container is not healthy. So this is the purposely I've given a wrong health check. Okay. So how do we fix this situation? So this is where, if you try to see that your container health check is failed, then you need to check for the logs. Okay. So you need to find out the application log and see why your application is failing for the health check. And then we need to talk to the dev team and find out, is there any change that happened, or is there anything which you have to change in the property of the pod so that your health check has to be running fine, or sometimes health check itself has to be updated. Apart from that, this error clearly indicates that your application is not able to run properly. So based out of the logs from the application, we need to figure it out and then work with the dev team to fix it. Okay. Huh. Again, it got stuck. My bad. Anyway, I'll delete it. So we saw two scenarios for crash loop. Well, we have one more. Again, I'll do a watch. And let's go ahead with option 11. So this is also crash loop where your pod is marked as loop. Now, look at the error. Now, this is when, if your pod has a pattern. What is pattern? So again, going back to our basics or the classes, for every pod you will have one main application, that is the main container. But apart from that, you can have a pattern where if you need a init container or a sidecar container. So in this example, if you have a init container in your pod, as soon as your pod gets assigned to a machine, the first thing it will do is try to create the init container, and only when the init container is successfully executed, whatever the commands or script, it will then go to the main container. So what is happening here? The init container itself is failing, because of which the pod is getting recreated, and once again the init container is failing, so your pod is marked as crash loop back off. Okay, so again, this is a straightforward error, but still you can do a kubectl describe and cross check. So you can see your pod is assigned to a machine, and then it's trying to download an image of CentOS for the init container, and this is failing. So it's not even moving to the main container. Now to understand, let's check the example also. Now what I've done in this, I've just taken a simple pod in which there is one init container and there is one main container. Now you can see for the init container, I am creating a container from CentOS image, and purposely in the startup command, I'm returning 1. So that means as soon as the init container creates, it will fail. So because of this, again and again and again, it just tries to recreate the init container, because only if the init container is successfully completed its task, then it goes to the main container. Okay. If not, remember, this is another scenario of crash loop where your pod is marked as crash loop backoff. So once again, you need to find out why this container init container is failing with the help of the logs and try to solve that. Okay. Okay. Now, what's our 12th option? Okay. This is also a crash loop. And interestingly, it is for a different error. So once again, now this is where we are into the third phase. What is the third phase? Your pod has been assigned to a machine, image is downloaded, container is created, container is running, but once again, for some reason, your application is failing. Okay, it could be a health check issue. That's all one of them. But this time, now it's going into a crash loop. Okay, now for this, what is crash loop? Same thing. If you try to do a kubectl describe, you will see your main container is getting recreated again and again. Why? There is some problem. So to understand, you need to check the logs. So that's exactly where, if you have not used any of the logging mechanism, because in Kubernetes, logging is important to capture all the application logs. If not, you can use another command called kubectl logs and then give the pod name. So over here, if I run, so you should see your pod is failing for a connection. What connection? A database connection. So let me show you. Okay. So this example, what I have done, I'm using our Vesvatech web application, that is the Spring Boot sample that we have seen in the class, right? So now if you run, the Spring Boot application will be running. Now, since Spring Boot is more of a front end, now for your front end to run, the basics we know is that it has to connect to a backend or a database. So this is where I have purposely written the code in such a way there is no database. So what is happening? Your Spring Boot application or front end application is trying to run, but while it is running, it is checking for a database connection. And since there is no database, or the database details that you have given in your application is not reachable, because of that, your application is failing. And as soon as it fails, your container is tried to recreate and again it fails. So because of this, it becomes a crash loop. And this is another scenario for the error. And sometimes in the interview, they might also ask you, give me some real-time scenarios error. So if you see something called JDBC, so for the Java applications or Spring Boot applications, if you are referring to a database, correct? So then we refer to it using a string called JDBC, that is Java Database Connection String, which is the URL. So here I'm referring to a MySQL database and that is not available, and hence it's giving this error. So again, by this, how do you fix? So you need to make sure whether your database is up and running and it is connectable, or sometimes what will happen, there will be too many connections to the database, so database will reject any new connections. So in those kind of situations, you need to work with the respective database team or system admin team or with respect to QA team and find out why we are not able to connect to the database. Okay, so this is our next scenario where your pod can go into crash loop. Okay, so these are 4 scenarios. Okay, so your pod can go into crash loop because the health check of a container failed, or your application is not able to connect to another microservice or to a database, or it doesn't have sufficient memory because of your resource limit, which is the out of memory issue that you can take. All right. Or another option that we saw is it's failing in the init container itself. Basically, it's not even going to the main container. So for all these scenarios, you will have the crash loop error. Okay. Now, the last option, which is once again a runtime error. And this is an interesting error. And this is also something which you will face very common. So what will happen now? First, let me run this and show you. And let's take the 13th option. Okay, so if you watch carefully, pod is getting created or assigned to a machine, container image is downloaded, container is created, and your application is also running successfully, because of which pod is marked as running. Okay, and do a kubectl describe. You don't see any error or issue. Perfect. Everything is perfect. Now, what is that scenario? QA team, or let's say in production, the users or customers, they will say they are not able to access your application. Now, this is a specific type of error where the problem is application is not accessible. But you see, by running the kubectl get command and the kubectl describe command, you do not see any error. And the number of replicas what you wanted is also running. Okay. Then what could be the issue? So this is where you have to go back to your basics, right? Again, from the classes. You create an object like deployment object to make sure how many replicas you need, it should be running. Or in simple, the object that you create is deployment object, so that your pod gets the ability to scale and replicate. So that is how, if you tell 2 replicas, 2 copies of your pod will always be running. Okay. But in the class or the basics, what is that we learned? How to access your pod. And that's where there is another object called service, correct? So what I have done, I have already created an object called service. Okay. And this is where I wanted to show you this code also quickly. So if you look at the last error, I have a deployment object with 2 replicas, and it is running our Apache on port 80. That is okay. And I'm using a service, and I'm created the service as cluster IP, and I've mapped the 80 of the pod to 80 of the service. So pod is running fine. And this is where, just to show you, if you want to access the pod directly, I can use the IP. See, I can take any one of them and it works, correct? Whether I take first pod or second pod, it's working fine. But what is happening? Now, there is a service created called demo service, and this is the cluster IP. Now, what happens if I do a curl of my service IP address, that is the virtual IP, and this is where it's also running. Why it is running? Okay, now this is where, if everything is working fine, then there is a no issue. But what I'll do is, let me do a small change. So looks like the labels are perfect. That's the reason. What I'll do quickly, I'll do a small change. So VI, let's go to this. And what was the YAML file? Runtime. Okay. So now, if everything is working fine, it's okay. But usually, what is the basics? I think let me put it up in the notepad so that you can understand. So when you try to access your service with the IP, that is called as the virtual IP. Now the service redirects it to a pod. How does it know to which pod it has to go? So that is where service will use a label, and whichever pods matches the label, it will exactly get redirected. And that is where, if you have more than one pod, then we will be doing a load balancing. Okay. Now, this is when you can see the example that for my pod, I have used a label called Vesvatech Adam, and the same label called Vesvatech Adam is there on the selector. So that is where, now what happened? You are trying to access your service, and your service redirects to any of the pod which is available. Okay, but what we will do now, anyway, I've deleted them. Let's, before I recreate, I just now deleted it, right? So let's try to change. And now watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a wrong label. Okay. So now I'm saying create a service which should point to a pod which has a label called Vesvatech students. However, your actual pod in which Apache is running is Vesvatech Adam. So label doesn't match. Now this is the scenario where, again, if I go back, kubectl get pods. So watch this. We'll try to rerun the same scenario. Okay, so everything is perfect. It's going into running state. Okay, and this is where there is no error. So now if you do a kubectl service get service, okay, so watch this. So if I say curl the service IP colon 80, it says I'm not able to redirect. This is because the label what you have given is not matching the label of the pod. Again, this is just to show you a scenario where your pod is running fine, but there could be a issue in your networking or your communication. So this is where, to debug, first you need to check whether your pod is accessible. Like for example, I can check, is my pod accessible? Yes, you can see pod is accessible. Then the issue could be with the service, wherein your pod is accessible, but your pod is not reachable from service. So this is where the problem can be in service, or in case if your service is mapped to a load balancer, then if there is a problem in the DNS of your load balancer, that could be a problem. But first, to solve, check whether service is fine. Now in this case you can check service itself is not fine, and every time you create a service also creates something called as endpoint. Okay, so in the class I have told, right, endpoint is the final URL. So now if you say kubectl get endpoint, for this service called demo service, there is no endpoint. So endpoint is nothing but which pod it has to access. So now you can easily identify, okay, problem is service is not able to redirect it to the right pod. Okay, so what could be the issue? So that is where you need to find out, is it a networking issue or is it an issue with the label? Now just to fix it, if I quickly update the label, right, now I'll just give the label same proper value and quickly we'll apply. Okay, and now your service got updated, and now if you type kubectl endpoint, you should see, since there are two pods in which the label is matching, it's redirecting to both of this pod, which is this IP and this IP. So this is called as endpoint. And now if you try to access your service, that is the cluster IP, this one, okay, this one, and now if you try to access, it will redirect it to the right pod. In fact, when you have more than one pod, it will do a load balancing. So this is where, if a customer or a QA or a user tells that they are not able to access the pod, then you need to understand what is the problem. So start debugging. Is the pod accessible? Okay. Then check whether the service is fine, it is accessible. And in case if you have a load balancer between, and if service also fine, then go back and check whether load balancer is accessible or not accessible. And at sometimes this could also be working fine. Then you need to know, where is your load balancer running? For example, your load balancer is running in cloud like AWS. Then check whether in AWS things like ingress or egress, right, in this case ingress, which is the inbound rule. So is there any inbound rule set which is not allowing the traffic to your load balancer? So that's where you might have to check the security group and follow up, is there any issue? So that's how you need to start debugging everything one by one. Okay. So with this, if you go back now, most of you guys think it's very difficult to clear a DevOps interview, or even when a scenarios like this come, how do you debug? Now, all you have to do is first understand what are the basic concepts, because without the basic concepts, if you just try to jump into some advanced thing, it will be always difficult. So when you say you're learning Kubernetes, remember, learning Kubernetes is not just about pods or some service or deployment objects. You need to know and be familiar about all the different objects that we have. So there are objects to run your pod, there are objects to scale your pod, there are objects to help you to communicate to the pod, right? There are objects to inject properties or secret, again, to help you with health checks, volumes, and again, for administration, there are plenty of other objects that we have, like resource quota, limit range, namespaces, auto scaling, right? Taints and tolerations, affinity. There's huge number of things. So make sure first you understand all this and then start looking into the errors step by step. Only then it'll be easy. And while we are talking about this, let me also take the same opportunity to help you how exactly you should be switching your profile from a non-IT, or let's say you're an IT but you're into support or into the dev or into the QA side, and from that to a successful career into DevOps. Now for this, I would like to take a live example of one of our recent candidate who has or who had around 3 years of experience as a QA. But again, like everyone, the first question that you will also get is, okay, if I just apply with my 3 years experience into DevOps, will I get a job? So first, what you have to do is you have to understand that market is expecting a relevant experience. So how do you convert your current profile into a relevant profile? So for this, I suggest to follow a 4-step approach once again. So the very first step is, before you jump into the tools and concepts in DevOps, there are a lot of basic things, which is the fundamental things that you need to know. Why? Now, when you go to market, the positions are like, some people call it as DevOps, some call it as SRE, some call it as DevSecOps. So first thing you need to be aware, in the market, whether we say DevOps, SRE, DevSecOps, or cloud, what is the common things across and what is the fundamental or the foundation things you need to know? So first step is to prepare those foundation. An example of what I mean by foundation, you should be first familiar about what is agile methodology, how a company is using agile methodology, and how are they doing release. So what exactly is a release? When development happens, when does the testing happens, how do you do the release? Okay, and when I say testing, what are the different types of testings you need? And for an organization to work, what are the different infrastructures that you need, like dev environment, QA environment, staging environment, production environment, and when to use what? So these are some of the basics that you need to know before you get started. And along with it, you don't need to know how to write a program, but obviously as a DevOps engineer or SRE engineer, when you try to go to a company, what is that you will do? You will try to build application and deploy application, right? Like in Kubernetes, you might deploy a front end or a back end. So this is where, do you understand how many components are there in your application or a web application? And that is where concepts like microservice is necessary. You don't need to know the program, but what is microservice? If you take a product, how many applications is divided into different parts? That's where you need to understand the architecture of a web application, and what do you mean by microservices, and how does an organization use this architecture to develop and release a product. And next, what you need to know is, what are the program essentials or the basics of programming, which is not to write code. Now let's say, as a DevOps engineer, you are expected to build a Java program and deploy a Java program in Kubernetes. For that, you don't need to know how to write Java, but you need to know, how do I build a Java? How do I deploy a Java application? what is needed for me to run a Java application. Now, if there are a machine given to me, how do I build Java? For that, do you need JDK? Do you need SJRE? Or what kind of memory is needed, which is what we call it as heap memory? So like that, what are the essentials of that programming language which is needed to only build the application and deploy? And what exactly do you mean by build? What do you mean by deployment? That's also something that you have to learn. And eventually, some of the other basics like version controlling, because end of the day, as a DevOps engineer or SRE engineer, you need to be first familiar on how do we use some version controlling like Git, regardless of what kind of files that you are managing. Okay, so this will be your first step to learn, and also to learn the basics of some Linux operating system. So this gives you a foundation so that whatever the tools that you're going to learn next, it will be easy. So in the second phase or the second step, I want you to learn the actual tools which is needed for each of this. Now that is where in DevOps or SRE, you have Terraform or something similar for infrastructure, Ansible for configuration management. For build, you have different kind of tools. And again, to automate it, you will have tools like Jenkins or GitLab. And for deployments, you have tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and for DevSecOps, there are a bunch of other tools like GitOps based tool, monitoring based tool. So that's your second step in understanding what is the current market requirement and what and all are the latest tools that you have to learn. And eventually, the third step will be to prepare projects. Okay, so once you learn the concepts and then start doing projects, wherein project should not be just about one tool. You should be doing projects which will touch base all the tools I am talking. Because in reality, if you are trying to do some work, you need to know you will be using Docker, you will be using Kubernetes, you will be using AWS, you will be using shell scripting, Terraform, Ansible, Jenkins. So how does it put together? So that's where you have to do lots and lots of projects which can help you to understand end to end. And the fourth step is, how do you take all those what you have practiced and convert it into your profile? Okay, so that your overall experience adds value. And that's exactly what one of our candidate did, or what we suggest and all our candidates do. Okay, so to help in such a scenario for all the candidates. So this is when we have our specific course, which we call it as the DevOps Ninjas program, in which we don't just talk about only the DevOps, because in the market, if you see, there are different tools, right? Different designation. So we don't want you to worry by just sticking to one position. Now we want you to apply whether the opening is for a DevOps or SRE or DevSecOps or cloud. So if you look at all of them, underlying works in the same concept, but the only difference is the amount of the tool that you take will be different. That's all. So in that way, when we go through this course, we make sure you learn all the tools related to DevOps and related to SRE and related to DevSecOps, and then start implementing projects so that you can apply to any one of this position, or you can apply to multiple position, and that's when you will be able to get a better profile and a better salary. Okay, and for this, we also ensure that the same four-step method is being followed, where we first understand all the prerequisites that is needed. So that is where, regardless of what background you are, whether you are from non-IT or in IT, but you are into ops team or support team or dev team or QA team, first let us learn about what's the prerequisites. Okay, and then we'll jump into the tools, wherein we divide the tools into three categories, and we will be learning the tools for DevOps, SRE, and DevSecOps. And then we will be doing lots and lots and lots of projects, where we will first get expert in each of the tool, and slowly we will do capstone projects which can connect you end to end, and then you will be able to showcase. And the fourth step is the mentoring part, because it's the same tool, same project, but how you should put. So that is the area where we want to specifically focus and mentor for each one of you, how you should be changing this project and how you should be talking. Because when you go to an interview or you're talking to a client or a customer, you should not be saying that, hey, I have years of experience in QA and I have knowledge in DevOps. So what they need is, do you have the relevant of 3 years of experience? So how do you convert your current experience into this is where we will be able to mentor. And we will also have lots of interview preparation, mock sessions, so that we make sure you carry that 3 years or 4 years of relevant experience and then try to switch with a better profile. Okay. So with this, I would like to invite every one of you to join our masterclass, which is where the very first part that I was talking about, the prerequisite. So do not worry where if you are a complete fresher or a beginner or a non-IT or even anywhere in the IT. So first, what we will do in this masterclass, which is for free 3 days, we'll try to learn all the concepts about what is agile, what kind of release activities will happen, how testing happens, what are the different types of testing, what is microservices architecture, how does your web application look, and what does you mean by front end, back end, or the middle tier, right? And not only that, and talk and learn about concepts like Git, GitLab, how do you get familiar with it? And you can also learn the application essentials, like, okay, if it's a Java application, what is that you need to know? What if it's a Spring Boot application? What are the things you need to know? And what do you mean by build? And what do you mean by deployment? So let's learn all these concepts and make sure that before you do a deep dive into the tools or to kickstart your actual learning, prepare this, which will give you a confidence, because many people do not really understand why we need it. But let me give you a simple example where it might be really reflecting you. Now someone says, hey, I've learned Jenkins, I've learned Kubernetes. Okay, you will learn the concepts, but when it comes to debugging, this is where in the interview they will ask, hey, tell me what kind of challenges you faced. Well, that's the reason you will not be able to tell real time. Or let's say another situation where I will ask, okay, you said you have used Kubernetes. Can you please tell me how many applications you have deployed in your cluster? Or how big is your cluster? How many machines you are using? Or can you tell me what is the capacity of your machine? Or how many times do you do the build or deployment in a day? Well, you don't have an answer. So that's where, before jumping into the actual tools, you need to be familiar with the entire process of the release and the concepts of what is application essential and microservices or build and deployment. And that's the purpose why we want everyone to attend this masterclass. Okay. And this is usually what people will charge you, anywhere around 8 to 10K, but this is going to be completely free for everyone to join, whether it's on Classroom or online. And when is it? It's going to be specifically on Jan 6th, 7th, and 8th, morning 7 to 9:30 a.m. IST. Okay. So with this, once again, I would like to